Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Joe.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G., and joining me today, Dr. Joseph Zompetti, a professor in the School of Communication. Hi, Joe.
Hi, how are you doing, Jim?
I'm hanging in there. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So, a little context as we're talking today. We want to talk today about having conversations in class, and our theme is kind of divisive discourse. And it is just a little context. We're recording this a couple weeks after the presidential election. Let me start out really quickly, Joe, and ask you, what have you been experiencing in class this semester as far as conversations with students?
Actually, I think the conversations this semester have been really productive and friendly. And there's, I think, a clear contrast actually from this fall semester during a presidential election as compared to the 2016 presidential election. I'm not really quite sure why the differences exist, but this semester has been pretty good. Now, I think that there are some folks that perhaps are not talking as much as they may have otherwise, or some people feel maybe a little silenced, which is something that I really work toward eliminating, or at least reducing that kind of discomfort. But and so I fear that might be a possibility. But I think overall the tenor has been much more positive this semester than 4 years ago.
When you're talking about making kind of a welcoming environment where students are encouraged to participate, because I've, again, full disclosure, I've taken some of your classes. You were the chair for my thesis committee. So I'm familiar with how you've conducted classes. Granted, that was like a decade ago, right?
Right.
And we've all grown as teachers. But what do you do to make that welcoming environment? Because I know that having discourse in your courses is so important to how you're trying to get students to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's difficult. I would say there is a particular challenge in during the time of COVID because everything is online. What I normally try to do is in a physical face-to-face space, have everyone sit in a circle, and it creates a more intimate environment. And I sit with the students, so I try to eliminate as much as possible the sort of the physical representation of a hierarchy, or somebody that's lurking over them or hovering over them, and instead I try to make it as equitable, or as level of a hierarchy sort of as possible, so that everyone feels like they have the same sort of input. So that's number one. And so as best I can, I try to emulate that online as well. But what I can do that's easily translatable to an online environment is to say some things at the beginning of the semester and then act upon them. So it's not like I'm just talking out of one side of my mouth and then being this draconian professor on the other hand. So what I try to do is I try to say, look, pretend that we're all in this together, that we're all a bunch of friends and we're sitting around chatting about politics. And it's okay to have disagreements. You have disagreements with your friends, but at the end of the day, you're still friends. And so that's that's the sort of the number one premise that I have when I try to create a climate that's conducive to this sort of talking in my classes. And so then what I have to do is I have to be genuine about that. And I have to follow through. I have to let them have a voice in the class. I have to shut up and sit back and let them talk. One thing that I've been doing since you've had class with me is in the syllabus I have some parameters that I try to establish, fair talk, that sort of thing. And then of course in my book that I wrote for the class, which is also called Divisive Discourse, it lays out some ground rules too. But what I've been doing recently is asking the students to come up with their own ground rules. That way they have some skin in the game. They have dictated what they think is fair, what they think is equitable, what they think is out of bounds. And so then when something does get out of bounds, it's a lot easier for me to kind of rein it in because they're the ones who have established it. So and it just makes sense. Again, if I'm going to be sincere about trying to be inclusive and try to give everyone a voice, then I shouldn't be the only one establishing rules and enforcing those rules. So I think if everybody has a say and everybody has an idea of what the semester is going to be like, what sort of things are we going to be talking about, and how are we going to approach them? And I think that that alleviates some of the anxiety right off the bat. And then at first, I think a lot of students are still a little intimidated.
Hmm.
Many students don't like to participate in general, much less in a class about politics. But once we get into the swing of things, we get in our own little rhythm, and the students get to know each other a little bit better. And they realize that the other person is not the enemy, that they're a human being just like they are. And everyone comes at this from different experiences. And that diversity of experiences is actually something that we can learn from, even if, again, we disagree at the end of the day. Then it's positive, I think, all around. And and it's okay sometimes to just sit there and shut up and listen,
Hmm.
even if you disagree with someone, because it gives you a completely different perspective, and that's something that we can all appreciate, even if we don't agree.
What are some of the techniques that you use to prepare them to talk in class? Because I remember, for example, we used to prepare questions about the readings, and that was an expectation that you'd set. What are some of the expectations that you set so they have something to talk about naturally when they come into class?
Yeah, that's a good question. We still do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But what we try to do is at the very beginning of the semester, again, it's all about sort of creating a climate and then building on that. It's sort of a scaffolding kind of approach. And so in the very beginning, it's really about creating a climate or an atmosphere of comfort, that we're all in this together. We're going to embark on this journey together. We're going to learn together. And as a result, we all have a part to play. And so that means we have to participate. And I try to explain, or not necessarily explain, but I try to impress upon them the importance of democracy. A lot of students try to figure me out, am I conservative, am I liberal, whatever. And when they ask me, sometimes they'll ask me, and my answer is, well, I'm pro democracy, and that means that we have to appreciate and include and respect the differences of opinions that exist. I think that we lay that groundwork, that democracy is the goal here. That also includes, of course, the responsibility, as well as the duty and the honor of participating, because that's, we are blessed with a democracy, and we should cherish that. And so, we talk about, well, what would it be like to not have a democracy? What would it be like to not have the ability to jump on Instagram and voice your inputs on, on what your friends are talking about, or so forth? Because that could happen, because it does happen in other countries. So once we lay that groundwork, I try to create this genuine atmosphere where everyone feels like they have a voice, that they can participate. And again, that may take a little bit of time for some students, but we inch along and we get there. And the first few weeks, I'd say, well, maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks, we talk mostly about theoretical things. So what does it mean to say that politics in the United States is polarized? What does it mean to say that someone's a communist or a fascist? What does it mean to say that uh, people are a liberal, or people are pro-life or pro-choice? And so
Hmm.
we lay out all that, and then we talk about what are some of the rhetorical strategies that people use to divide to divide Americans
Hmm.
in political discourse. And so we look at the people, the political pundits, the politicians, the folks that have a megaphone, really, and they're the ones that tend to use these kinds of techniques. That, since most of us have never had a class on how to have a conversation, much less a political conversation,
Hmm.
a lot of Americans mimic that behavior. And so, if we can identify that behavior, then at least my hypothesis is, if we can identify it, then we can avoid it. And so that's what we do. That's how we start off the class, and then so now everybody is sort of on the same page after about week 3 about, you stick to the issues, you don't call people names,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
try not to create an us versus them mentality,
Hmm.
those sorts of things. And then when we get into the readings about actual controversial issues, which is what we do, we'll talk about everything from healthcare, gun control, religion, um, race in America, all the hot topics. And so the students will do those readings, and I ask them to think about those readings critically before they come to class, and they have to write what I call critical observations, so that they have really kind of thought those ideas through a little bit.
Hmm.
And as a result, not only have they thought through those readings, but they will always have something to say. So there's no excuse to not participate in my class as long as they've done the readings.
So, listening to you talk about this, I'm imagining that for the spring semester, a lot of our colleagues on campus who aren't teaching political communication classes are still looking to have more of that interaction that you're talking about in their own courses. And it seems to me the message I'm kind of getting from what you just said is that it's something that builds over time. That we shouldn't expect on day one, there's no set list of things that you can do on day one to boom, create a community instantly and have productive and engaging conversations with students. It's something that requires a little bit of work. I can imagine that students who don't know you very well, when you say I'm pro-democracy, some of them are probably like, well, that's a dodge, right? That's what you would say, right? Until they see you, as you pointed out, you walk the talk and give them an agency in the class and everything else. So one final little thing before we get into some actual steps that I know you've kind of outlined about how these discussions work in the context of your course. What are some little things that you have done for this class that you think would work for other courses that you teach that may not necessarily be as much about the divisiveness in political communication and whatnot? A basic rhetoric class, or even if you're doing a graduate seminar on research or anything like that. What are there any little techniques that you think are good for all time zones that you teach in?
Yes, yeah, I think so. If I understand your question correctly, let me sort of back up a bit. Maybe this will answer the question. Hopefully it will. So one of the reasons why I think I developed this course back in, I think it was around 2014, was not only because I saw this divisive discourse, this toxicity, in our everyday conversations, because that certainly was the case. I mean, that was pretty evident, and it's only, I think, gotten worse. But part of my teaching philosophy, ever since graduate school, ever since my very first job, has really always been trying to create an atmosphere where students feel empowered, that they're not just objects where we deposit information into them and then ask them to regurgitate on a multiple choice test or something. That's never been my style, and I never appreciated that as a student, and I never really saw the value of it when I was a student. And so I've always really tried to emphasize the students' experiences as they enter the classroom and meet them sort of where they are based upon those experiences, and then build on that. And in my experience, I've always found that is a very strong way to facilitate learning. It's highly organic. It's highly experiential. It actually runs against what a lot of the studies say, because it's very difficult to apply a rubric to that kind of a situation. It's very difficult to develop lesson plans ahead of time. And so I know that a lot of my peers and colleagues and even folks at CTLT may kind of scratch their head a little bit at my approach, but that's okay. One of the things that I've also sort of had to wrestle with is that while I think that my approach works well for me, that doesn't mean that it works well for everyone. And if another professor enjoys, I don't know, providing PowerPoints and has a bunch of rubrics and lots of multiple choice tests and so forth, well, that's fine too. In fact, I think it's probably good that our students are exposed to a diversity of different types of teaching methodologies. So early on, I was on this, I don't know, this high horse, thinking that I had all the answers, but I don't. And I think that actually, even though something doesn't work for me, or I may disagree with a particular type of teaching philosophy, at the end of the day, I think it's really important for our students to be exposed to all of those approaches, because quite frankly, they're going to have to be flexible when they go out into the work world, right? So in any case, that was sort of my thinking, though, early on, was that I sort of have the silver bullet here. I've got the magic touch on how to reach students. And what I realized was that it just works for me. It may not work for other folks, and I still had a lot of learning to do, of course. But as I've come along, through the years, it hasn't always worked. There have been a couple of occasions when I've had students that, I don't know how to say this kind of politely, but anyway, they cross the boundaries,
Sure.
and
Sure.
and we had some issues,
Hmm.
but that probably is natural as well. And I learned from those moments, and I think that the other students that experienced that with me learned from those moments. And I think that's all you can really ask of a teacher, and all you can ask of students, right, is to try to create that as a learning moment as best as possible.
Hmm.
But in any case, um, I've always felt strongly that students need a little bit of a push. They need some tough love. They need the opportunity and the availability to be able to express themselves, and they need some space and a little bit of help occasionally to kind of put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, and so that's the kind of the environment I try to provide, as opposed to the heavy wielding kind of instruction.
Hmm.
And so as a result of that kind of a teaching philosophy, I then come to this situation where I notice that not just sort of the general American milieu of sort of this vitriol that was existing in back in 2014, and even before that. But that's when I sort of had this epiphany, and then I realized, well, our students are mimicking this too. It was pretty evident that we had conservative students who felt uncomfortable on campus, and we had some liberal students who felt uncomfortable because other folks were, saying things that they shouldn't be saying. And we had and it was very incredibly complex. It still is, but I felt like, well, in our small world here in the School of Comm, maybe there's something I can do about this. And
Hmm.
so I developed this class based upon those kinds of principles of organic experiential learning. And as we've just described, it's kind of evolved from there. And I think that as a result, the class is not only improved, but I think that the students are learning a lot more as well.
We've done some episodes in the past, and CTLT has some resources on dealing with, I think, what some people call hot moments in class. So we'll link to those on the show page for this episode. The other thing, though, is, well, let me be frank. Give yourself some credit. I mean, yes, you may not use rubrics, but rubrics are a form of feedback ultimately, and you are, in my opinion, one of the most, and I mean this in a good way, intense graders of written work. You give a lot of feedback on written work, and I'm not just talking about the master's thesis or something like that. I'm talking about everyday, short writings that you have your students do in class. So I think students getting that sort of feedback, and also the feedback that you have within a structure you've built that they get from each other, I think that goes a long way towards supporting what you're talking about this particular style that you've developed. Students, and in a way, it's great because you're getting them away from being focused on that letter grade or that point value, which is a whole nother podcast. But,
Yes.
I continue to work on that even in something like Com 110 or the broadcast performance course I teach. It's doing the work, it's the learning, and having the discussion that is where the learning takes place. The grade is a
Yes.
certification later.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, uh, it doesn't matter how many times I say that, though. There are some students that still don't believe me. so,
Right, and it's the
so they'll
world we
drop
all
the
grew up in, right? Yeah,
right, right. So
yeah,
they'll drop the class before, of course, they get to the end where they
right,
actually get to see the fruits of their labor. But for
right,
those students who stick with it, I think you're right. At least I hope, most of them, they
yeah.
they ultimately get it.
So we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how there really is no prescription that you can give for other instructors. You have to just be aware, and you've used the word organic. It develops organically. But you did before we actually got together on Zoom today. You did kind of come out with a brief little list of how a discussion goes in your course, and I think that's something that a lot of instructors, regardless of what they're teaching, can hang their hat on. So could you go over that a little bit, and we can talk about that?
Sure, sure. Well, in my book, I list 20 things, but for today, I picked the 10 that I think are probably the best of the 20. And and again, these are sort of modular, right? So you can use these depending on the situation. But these are just sort of kind of guidelines, if you will, about how to engage in a conversation with someone for whom you might disagree. And it doesn't have to be about politics. It could be about religion. It could be about, Cubs versus the Cardinals. I mean, really, it doesn't really matter. Any kind of tension or acrimonious kind of environment, these are should be helpful. Again, these are not panaceas. They're not going to solve every problem,
Hmm.
but if you kind of keep these in mind, I think that they can go a long way toward improving our conversation. And again, remember, we we most of us anyway never had a class on how to have a conversation,
Hmm.
and we certainly have never had a class on how to have a political conversation. So our role models, the people that we mimic, are actually bad role models for the most part, because we're looking at those people that are, for the most part, the ones that are dividing America.
Hmm.
So we really have to unlearn some really bad habits. So the very first thing that I tell students is that we have to listen, and we have to actively listen. And that means that we have to that doesn't mean, as someone else is talking, you pick up your phone and you check your text messages or anything. I know
Hmm.
listening means you're intent on, and you have a purpose of actually listening to what the other person has to say, that you actually care about what they are saying, and that you process what they're saying, as opposed to just tuning them out and letting them have some space. It's actual a participatory activity, not just a passive thing. And related to that is number two, and that is to think before responding. To think before responding. When I was a little kid, I was a real talkative person. I'm sure you can't imagine this, but I just I just loved to get in there and talk and talk and talk and talk. And my dad would always kind of scold me and would say, son, you got to think before you talk. You got to think before you talk. And it wasn't until actually, much later, in my early adult years, that started making sense to me.
Yeah, me
Because
too. Me too.
if you just come right out and interject whatever's on your mind, you could get into trouble, right?
Yeah. As a side note, I now have a rule that I will read an email, I will mark it as unread, close it, go walk away, come back, and then I'll respond to it. So it works not just in conversations in real time.
That's right. That's right. And that's a practice I need to start doing for sure. But yeah, most of us are like this, right? Something
Hmm.
triggers something inside of us, and we feel this impulse, and we want to express ourselves. That's natural, but we have to sort of pump the brakes and
Hmm.
process and think about, well, what are the implications, the ramifications if I say X, Y, Z, right?
Hmm.
And I think that if we do that, that can help reduce a lot of the tension.
And is that a role that you find yourself playing when you're fostering a discussion in class? Are you the one that you have to say, "Hey, wait a minute, let's think about that for a moment"?
Oh yeah,
And, and,
absolutely.
and how do you do that? I mean, is there a without making it sound like someone said something necessarily wrong? It's just something that's we need to process.
Right. Well, that's exactly what happens when something. I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe, but when you're a teacher and you hear someone say something, you've got like four or five hairs that immediately go up in the back of your neck, right?
Hmm.
Well, when that happens, that's like a trigger for me to say, oh, "Oops, okay, we need to take a little pause here." And so what I try to do is I try to immediately think of questions about whatever was just said. So, why did you say that? Why do you think some people believe that? Or what makes you think that some people would, get to that point, or whatever, those kinds of questions to
Hmm. Hmm.
unpack it, right? To tease it out a little bit, to not place a value on it, to not immediately come out and be judgmental about it, but rather let's try to understand. And and again, trying to making a learning moment as opposed to a scolding kind of a moment.
Hmm.
So that was number two. Number three is, think of the other person as someone who is special, or at least not the enemy, right? It's really kind of hard sometimes to love somebody who you really don't like. And I think that's also a natural human condition.
Hmm.
But I think that we can look at other people and say, all right, they're really not out to get me. Maybe they're misguided, maybe they've grown up a certain way, or maybe they're influenced by some things, but left to their own devices, they're not out to get me, right? They're not the enemy. And in fact, I think in our environment, it should I would hope that that really wouldn't happen. I would hope that most folks would would say, all right, well, you like the Cubs and I like the Cardinals, but we can still go out and get a beer or something, right? Um, and and that's really what this is all about. And so if we can create kind of if we can try to remind students that our classes are more like simulations of the real world,
Hmm.
and that this is practice for the real thing, then I think that also kind of changes their perspectives a little bit, because I think a lot of times if you go into the class and you automatically think like, well, this is the real world, then there's a lot more at stake.
Mm-hmm.
But let's back it up a little bit, right? I mean, we're in here to learn and to appreciate one another and appreciate other ideas. So yes, it is the real world, but this is really just a rehearsal.
That is a fascinating way of putting it. I mean, I've certainly had, when I'm explaining assignments to students, and again, like I always go back to Com 110 because that's what I'm teaching this semester, which is the basic public speaking course, which is a very regimented course. There are 80 sections of it. And when they want to give an impassioned first informative speech about X, Y, or Z, I say that's fine. But the real goal is to learn how to do the speech. The topic, I encourage you to do a topic that you're familiar with. We'll have the opportunity to go explore and gain new knowledge about a new topic that you then present to the class. But right now we're simulating an informative speech in order to learn how to do an informative speech. So that idea of class in general, though, extrapolating that as kind of simulation for a greater purpose, I think I'm stealing that line. I'm
Okay.
gonna be saying that at 8 a.m. on Wednesday.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's kind of a late in the game this semester, but
Yeah.
hopefully it'll work for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I should also say that all of these ideas are not necessarily my own. This is a compilation of things that I've gathered over years and
Mm-hmm.
from different sources. So
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure that this isn't all the credit is not should not go to me. All right, it should go to other folks. But in any case, number 4 is remember that we can always learn from others, even if we disagree with them. And this is a tough one, but it really is true. I mean, there are some folks in the political scene that I just can't stand, and of course I'm not going to tell you who those are because I try to be balanced, um, but I still listen to them anyway, even though they really anger me, and that's because every now and then they'll say something that I may not agree with it, but it causes me to think, or they'll use a particular technique that I hadn't thought of before. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
oh wow, that was pretty clever. Those kinds of things. And again, this actually comes from my dad. When I was a kid, he used to say that even a stopped clock is right twice a day. That means that even if there's somebody out here you disagree with, it doesn't mean that they're wrong 100% of the time. Every now and then they'll get something right,
Yeah.
and we should pick up on that.
I remember an exercise that we did in one of your classes, and I talked to Dr. Bill Anderson over in Family and Consumer Sciences has done something similar. We talked about that on a previous episode, where you would have a small issue. I'll call it a small issue. Maybe there are no small issues, but it was one that was easily researchable. And you would have us, we would pair up, and on one week, we would take one position on it, and then on the other week we would switch and take the opposite position. And it was a real good, as my grandmother used to tell me, never judge a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And it was a really good way of appreciating the fact that there are multiple perspectives in almost everything.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if you do that sort of an exercise, which you're right, well, actually, this class that we're talking about here, this divisive discourse class,
Mm-hmm.
what I'll have the students do is they'll research a liberal that is what we would consider toxic. And then they'd have to write about the rhetorical strategies that the liberal uses. And then a few weeks later, then they have to switch and they have to find a conservative that is toxic. So if the student is predisposed to a liberal ideology, well, they have to critique a liberal, which forces them, gives them some cognitive dissonance, right? It forces them to reconcile some of their opinions. And then if somebody's a conservative, right, they'd have to do the same thing. And then, of course, both you have to switch. So it not only, I think, creates a situation where you look at the other side and possibly the other side gives you something to offer, but it also forces you to critique your own ideology to see if you really have thought things through the way you should.
Hmm. And I think that leads nicely into number 5, which, as a recovering journalist, I also appreciate. But go ahead.
Sure, yes. Number 5 is be well informed. And that doesn't just mean you know everything there is to know from your own political perspective. It means diversify your news sources. One of the problems that, as you know, that we are experiencing today is the self-selection, the self-exposure that people have of news sources, which creates echo chambers. And on one hand, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in fact, it's great. We have all these choices. We have, and we get to choose the things that we like. That's wonderful. But on the other hand, if we're making really important decisions about democracy, then all of a sudden, if we are narrowing our exposure to just one particular ideology or one news source, then we're really missing out on a lot of
Hmm.
other perspectives. And what if our perspective is incorrect, or it doesn't have all the facts, or is really inflammatory? You're right. All of these kinds of questions, I think, then emerge that we have to wrestle with.
And I think encouraging our students to do that is important for them, uh, not just in a political context, but I mean, whatever the classes that they're taking. If they're having a discussion about something in biology, or if they're having, chemistry or cybersecurity, anything like that, they need to have that worldly perspective to apply the knowledge that they're learning in their classes. And in order to do that, they have to have a broad swath of knowledge to sample. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
think.
right. That's right. Well, and we also know that, like, let's say, if you enjoy watching MSNBC, MSNBC covers certain things, whereas if you switch to Fox, you might see, well, oh, Fox is covering a story that MSNBC isn't even covering.
Mhm.
So it isn't even always a question of political ideology. Sometimes it's just merely a question of what a particular news source deems salient, and as a result, you could be missing out on quite a bit.
Mhm.
Great. All right. So then number 6 is to challenge ourselves to see the world from someone else's perspective. And here I want to give a plug to the psychology department. They have an ongoing series based on empathy, and really kind of interesting stuff. Lots of different perspectives on what it means to be empathetic, or how to perhaps use empathy in the classroom or in your research, and those kinds of things. And this is really what this principle is getting at, right? Is to say, and of course we're never really going to be the other person, but again, if we think of the classroom environment as a simulation, well, then let's take it one step further. What if we were someone else? What do we think the world would look like? What kind of experiences do you think we would have? And of course, it's not going to be the exact same thing, but it at least causes our mind to shift gears a bit, to realize that, what, the world does not revolve around me. and
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and other people have problems too, and you know what, sometimes those problems are a lot worse than the problems I experience, and so on and so forth. And so if we can really kind of see the world from that kind of vantage point, then I think we will be a little less judgmental, perhaps,
Mhm.
when we're engaged in these conversations. And number 7 is, and this is a lot like one of the early ones, but is to choose our words carefully. This kind of goes along the lines of think before you speak, but
Mhm.
to choose our words carefully. But one thing I would add that's different than thinking before speaking is that choosing our words carefully means that we have to have some competence in our vocabulary.
Mhm.
We have to know what some words mean, and we have to know which words are sort of off limits, which are more appropriate or less appropriate, things of that
Mhm.
nature.
Mhm. Connotation versus denotation of words. And I think also, having talked about empathy, when we choose our words carefully, it has to be within the context of the person who's going to be hearing what we're going to say. And hopefully you have come to know them, or you are empathetic to their situation. And so I think being careful about your words falls into that as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And as teachers, this can be another one of those moments that were positive learning moments, where if you don't know what words to say, well, then ask. Let's have a conversation about that, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm frequently learning things. My students,
Right?
they have a whole new vocabulary that didn't exist when I was their age, and so
Mhm.
They say things that I have no idea what those words mean, and sometimes we need to unpack those.
Hmm.
So, okay, number 8 then is to avoid the blame game. Avoid the blame game, and instead let's focus on solutions. This one's hard. This one's
Hmm.
really hard because just about everywhere you go, conversations quickly devolve into, well, you did this, you did that, or so and so said this, so and so said that. And it's really easy to fall into this trap, in part because I think that when people feel harmed or if they have a grievance, then they want some sort of recompense and they want someone to kind of pay for it. And
Hmm.
and that is kind of what the larger American culture tells us is what is fair and just.
And we're all about winners and losers.
Exactly. Yes. Right. And there is this
Yeah.
competition element as well. And so, uh, unfortunately, though, I don't think that works well when we're having conversations over controversial things.
Hmm.
And because once you start getting into the blame game, then it's a lot harder to do these other principles. It's a lot harder to have empathy for someone else if you see them as being the culprit,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
For example, and so as hard as it is, I think we really need to try to avoid the blame game at all costs, knowing, of course, that we're going to slip up. This is not very easy to do,
Hmm.
but still, we need to try our best.
Hmm.
Number 9, so we're almost done. Remember that discussions are not competitive games. So this is what you were just mentioning, that our larger culture tends to stress competition. But when we engage in these conversations, we should remind ourselves that they are not debates.
Hmm.
That we don't have to win an argument. Instead, we should probably rethink them entirely. So instead of seeing these as these competitive games or exercises or things that we should really win, we should instead say, okay, well, what is it, instead of winning here, uh, what is it that I can learn? Yes, I have my opinions. I'm a very opinionated person. But when I have conversations with folks, sometimes I have to turn that knob off in my brain and say, look, this isn't about me convincing them one way or the other. This is really an opportunity for me to learn from them, because I know that one conversation is not going to change their mind anyway.
Hmm.
Right? If
Right.
we approach these conversations with a competitive mindset, we are always going to fail. We'll never win those competitions because one single conversation is never going to change someone's mind. If you are in it for a change, if you are really engaged in these conversations to persuade people, then that is a long process.
Hmm. Hmm.
It rarely happens overnight, and it almost never happens in a single conversation. So instead, let's look at it from a different angle, and instead of trying to win these as debates, let's try to learn from each other instead.
And I think that's where having learning goals for individual class sessions, I think, can be very helpful. If that can help you, and you don't have to have them written down necessarily, but even just expressing to students, okay, we're going to talk about this subject today, and what we're going to define as a win, for lack of a better term, or you'll come out of here with a better sense of whatever. And if they can honestly say to themselves that yes, we've done that, then I think I think that helps out a lot as
Oh,
far as kind of
absolutely.
diffusing that sort of we have to have winners, and conversely we have to have losers, or correspondingly we have to have losers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, not only are you not going to persuade people, but having that kind of a framework in place where you have winners and losers,
Hmm.
in my mind, automatically dooms the experience. It's a recipe for disaster because, as a teacher, you don't want to start with the premise that half your class are going to be losers,
Hmm.
right? That doesn't
Right.
make any sense.
Right.
So we have to completely reevaluate, I think, our approach to those kind of conversations. And then finally, if all else fails, if you forget all these other things, if you forget the theory and all that other stuff, there's one simple thing that you can always remember, and that is the golden rule. Treat others as you would hope that they would treat you.
Hmm.
And that's as simple as it needs to be.
Hmm.
And I think this, you asked me earlier what kind of cuts across different classes and different subject areas. Well, here you go. I mean, this is the basic thing, but we often forget it, right?
Hmm.
Maybe it is our competition culture. We want to feel like we're the winner, or we're the strong one, or maybe it's, yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's something else, toxic masculinity or something like that.
Right.
Whatever the issue is, uh, we need to, at times, I think, rewire our brains
Hmm.
and relearn things or unlearn things, and then
Hmm.
learn better things. And the simple golden rule is such an easy thing that we can insert into our daily lives. We just have to remember it, and remember those moments when you were involved in a conversation and somebody hurt your feelings, or
Right.
somebody called you a name, or somebody uh, uh, made you feel so small that you felt like you didn't have anything important to say, or you didn't have a voice, or that you felt like you were a loser and you just needed to give up, or that maybe you needed to drop the class because you weren't smart enough. All of us have experienced those moments, but how many times do we look back on those moments to guide our future learning? And
Hmm.
I don't think that we do enough of that. And
Hmm.
so, I often try to look at my students, and whether they're conservatives, liberals, somewhere in between, apolitical, it doesn't really matter to me. And I try to look at them, and I just try to think, well, eh, you know, I went through a similar experience, a different kind of class, different era and time, different issue, but
Hmm.
I remember what it felt like when someone said something like that to me. So
And I think,
let's flip it.
yeah, and I think the golden rule requires a certain amount of imagination, especially for those of us who may, now we can bring in the concept of privilege. Some of us, the slights that we felt or whatever are nowhere near on the level that others have felt as well, and so it does require, in some ways, this idea of the golden rule, or just treat others as you would like to be treated, requires all of the previous things that we've been talking about today. It's just kind of a way of operationalizing it without consciously thinking about it. If you can at least do that, so I think that's good
Right,
advice.
absolutely. Well, and that's the thing, right? So, yeah, I'm pretty, I'm very privileged, and I know that, but that's the thing, right? So there were moments in my life when, in terms of education, in classes and stuff, that I didn't feel very good about myself.
Hmm.
So if I felt that way, just imagine what it might be like for someone else who has a
Right.
lot less privilege, right?
Right.
And so
Exactly.
that's the framework I think that we need to approach this with.
That's great.
Again, I don't pretend to have all the answers.
Hmm.
This is a work in progress. As I said, it started in about 2014, so about
Hmm.
6 years in the making, and I'm still learning. Every semester is different, and I think that we have to, as instructors, as teachers, we have to be mindful of being flexible, of being adaptive, and not going into a situation with hard and fast rules, because these hard and fast rules are not always going to work,
Hmm.
and there's always more to learn.
That's great. And speaking of being adaptive, one final question before I let you go. What is there anything that you have learned this fall? And I'm thinking especially in the context of online teaching and how we had to pivot to online, some of us very quickly. Are there any little tips or tricks or little things that you definitely want to do or you definitely don't want to do when you're contemplating your spring courses?
That's a tough question, and I'm still processing. One of the things I try to do, don't always do it very well, but one of the things I try to do is, after every semester, really try to critically reflect on how the semester just occurred, and what things I can tweak to make it better. And so you're right, this semester has been completely different. It's been frustrating at times, but one of the good takeaways is, just last year when we were having face-to-face classes, one of the things I introduced is, because I was tired of students not coming to my office hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I was tired of not having that kind of connectivity with them to say, look, I'm not some evil, professor. I really am here to help you. I really do care. So come to my office hours, so I can help you. Well, I didn't really know what else to do, because it felt like I was just straining my voice every semester,
Mm-hmm.
and students really weren't picking up on it. So one of the things I did last year was I instituted a kind of mandatory, you come to my office hours at least once, I'll give you some points, and the session was really just to get to kind of know each other kind of thing. What are your expectations? How can I help you get there? Those kinds
Hmm.
of questions. Well, then COVID happens and I can't have students come to my office anymore, right? One of the things that I did was I said, okay, well, let's meet individually. We'll have our own little Zoom meetings, which was a scheduling nightmare. There's
Hmm.
probably an easier way of doing it. I'm just not very tech savvy. Uh, and I would say probably about 96% of the students actually did it with me. So I think that's pretty good number.
Yeah.
I think that it went really well. Not as good probably as the face-to-face meetings, but I think that if I hadn't had those individual meetings, those one-on-ones with students this semester, I think many of them would not be as engaged in the class. I think
Hmm.
I certainly wouldn't have known them as well as I do, and I think it was just really important. Even in this sort of what I call COVID world or Zoom world,
Hmm.
where we are struggling and yearning to have connectivity, even though it's not the same thing. Having these one-on-one meetings, I think, goes a long way to supplementing that, kind of fulfilling that.
Hmm.
And I think that they definitely helped. And so, yeah, I need to figure out a better way of scheduling them. And it took a lot of time. It's about a
Yeah.
half hour per student. That took a lot of time. There was about 3 or 4 weeks there where it seemed like all I was doing was having these Zoom meetings. But I think overall they were definitely worth it. So that would be my main takeaway this semester of what I did that I think
Hmm.
helped. And I would suggest maybe others think about it. Now, obviously, it wouldn't work if in large lecture classes probably, but if
Hmm.
you have smaller classes, it's something to consider.
Great. Joe, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's all the time we have for this episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can find out more about our podcast. Go to ctlt.illinoisstate.edu. For Dr. Joseph Zompetti, for all my colleagues at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, until we talk again, happy teaching.